Hello, hello, beautiful people. Welcome to People Always Ask. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I don't know exactly where you're watching, but I'm hoping that there's a lot of folks who are tuned in from all over the place because this topic is relevant to all of us who have people in our families who just don't understand this little thing called mental health and wellness. So today, our topic is how my family doesn't believe mental health is a part of our culture. And we have with us special guest Nancy Diaz, who is a nomadic therapist, and she specializes in working with people who consider themselves to be third culture kids. So that's kids who are growing up in a different culture than where their parents are from. And she's going to help us kind of figure out what it is, if anything, distressed folks who really need some mental health support who are in families where people just don't do that. What they can even do. How you doing, Nancy?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. So good to be here.
So I just want to be clear for the people as they're joining in. What is a third culture kid?
So exactly what you described it. So that's technically what the definition is. A third culture kid is just someone who's grown up in a culture outside of where their parents grew up. So, for example, I'm Mexican American. I could be all kinds of different things. Some people would say I'm a hyphenate because there's a hyphen in between Mexican and American. Some people might say I'm a third culture kid. I've actually had some people say I am not a third culture kid because both of my parents are from the same country. I've
Huh.
had some people say a third culture kid is actually someone who has grown up in different countries. So some like a military brat kind of thing.
Mm.
So it's interesting. And then as you go around the world, people have different terms for this, like in the US, immigrant is something that's used all the time. Here where I am in Australia, it's not used so much, they
Mm.
just say people from overseas or expats or and so and so there's all kinds of different terms, first generation, second generation, 1.5 generation. So that's why it's a little bit complicated to explain who it is that I work with. But yeah,
Yeah.
essentially, if your parents are immigrants, then I that's my bread and my butter because there's such complexity there. There's so many things that are unique to being, the son or daughter of immigrants. That we could go talking all day about this.
Well, let me just ask you straight out, do you have personal experience with this one where your family actually doesn't really, or at least didn't really kind of understand or support the idea of mental health?
Yes. Yes, definitely. And I think that that's just the cultural piece of it, right? And so we were talking right before we went live about how, my dad just doesn't believe in meditation and actually even gets mad now that my mom and my sister have gotten into meditation and yoga on my recommendations, right? So that they can stay sane in this pandemic and help reduce their anxiety. But he will leave the room if they have their guided meditation playing. He says that he can't fall asleep if they try to do like a sleep meditation. And so he's just super against it. When my sister was diagnosed with anxiety disorder, he and one
Mm.
of my other sisters had a really hard time believing it. And they said, like, no, she's faking it. Like, anxiety, like, that's not a thing. Like, she just doesn't want to go to school. Like, yeah, so definitely it has come up in my own family. And so that's why I love working with other clients who have this kind of problem because yeah, I've been there. It's all lived experience as well.
Well, first things first, what do you do if you're on a journey where you're like your sister struggling with an anxiety disorder and your family really doesn't understand some of the things that you need to do in order to take care of that? What would you say?
Yeah, well, that's really tough, and especially for her because she's really young. She's only 11 years old, so
Mm.
that makes it even more complex when she's struggling to learn what is anxiety disorder, and then there's the added complexity of like, do we want to put a label on her for the rest of her life as she's going through school and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
If you're an adult and you've been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and then having that conversation with your parents, that can be really tough, especially if they're, just telling you, to just pray about it, or they're just questioning that it's even a thing, or they're judging you for going to therapy, or, they don't want you to be on medication. There can be so many different reactions when you say like I have a mental health disorder, or even something like depression, super common, especially right now in this pandemic. And yeah, the reactions, and now it's even become a thing. I don't know if you've seen it, if you're in any of the therapist Facebook groups, of now it's like, you're a kid and you say to your mom, I have depression. And then it's like your mom says, and then there's like a thread, and therapists will comment as if they were the parents. And yeah, I've seen the Latinx thread about that. And yeah, it's like things like I'll give you a reason to cry about if you want a reason to cry, and things like that, and all problematic. Like if we're talking on the real, like yes, it's funny to think, but it's also like really sad that that's the real reactions that people are getting.
I think the hardest part of it, and this was part of what I was kind of posting in the preview for this, is that the silencing around the actual pain and the actual struggle of what's going on for a lot of people who are immigrants, who are people of color, who are Black in America. It's really a shame because the level of pain, the level of trauma is deep. So when you're talking about immigrant communities, you're not only talking about people who aren't talking about it. They don't go pray about it. We don't do that here. You're talking about people who really are hurting. So the combination means they're doing something to cope. What do you see people who aren't going to therapy doing to cope? Like, how do you actually see it happening in the parents, like in the actual older generations before this one? Because obviously they were not sitting down on the couch.
Yeah. I see a lot of prayer, like you said, and also I just see a lot of avoidance and just trying to distract themselves and just trying to forget about the trauma, which is fair enough. Like nobody really wants to talk about that kind of thing. And whenever I have a client come to me and they say like, yeah, I've experienced a trauma, I don't know if I want to talk about it. I'm like, I get that. I totally get that. Like it's hard to talk about those things that were so horrible. And then we can get into generational trauma too, and how that has actually been passed on, especially from immigrant families from generation to generation. And yeah, and that's super problematic because so that's why we have to think about it. Like this generation has to think about it in a new way. Like, yeah, maybe we have to accept that our parents or family members maybe will never accept us going to therapy, will never go to therapy themselves, for example. But we have to think about it as, we're doing this for the next generation. Like if I have kids, like I want to make sure that I can tell them proudly, like, yeah, like, I went to therapy and I worked on this. And yeah, even though like my parents did this and that was problematic, I want to make sure that I don't do that to you and don't re-traumatize you in that way. So yeah.
It's tough because then it makes me think about grandparents and those people who are young who have kids, or those people who, have kids and they're a little bit older, but their parents are around. When you think about people hiding, going to therapy, or fighting that battle, what do you recommend really? Because I mean, that intergenerational stuff, I don't know if there's a win there. Have you seen people successfully have that conversation?
It's hard, and I think that most of the times it is trying to teach clients how to have those conversations with their family members and how to set those boundaries. But a lot of it is also unfortunately acceptance, because they are just so set in their ways that, yeah. And especially when we're talking about like grandparents, like they are just like, my grandparents are just so stuck in their ways. They are just not going to change, and they're, they're getting up there in their old age, and so that they don't see the need to change now. They're like, we've been doing it this way for this long, and what's happened has happened. And so yeah, it is kind of hard, but I do think this is where like family therapy can be really good if you have a family member who's willing, or who you see maybe there's like a little bit of pushback, but if you have the right kind of conversation, they might be willing to join you in a therapy session. Then I definitely always recommend that. But yeah, unfortunately, like the clients that I've worked with, they a lot of them have issues with not being able to set boundaries, and all the pressure from their families, and especially like with immigrant parents, it's always, you have that pressure, to essentially be perfect, to get that degree, and to get that high paying job, and to give back to your community. And yeah, there's a lot of pressure.
I mean,
so it is.
there's a saying that basically what starts as coping can become culture, where essentially the idea is a lot of the things that we do that seem so out of whack on the surface these days start in a place where people are genuinely just trying to cope with whatever the situation is. And I think that's
Yeah.
what the sort of unquestioning around some of the things that people do. I think that's where it gets hard for a lot of people, right? Like it's like, okay, yeah, they do what they do. And I'm starting to learn all this stuff that says that's not true or that's not okay or that's not the best way of doing this. How do you work with acceptance while also kind of dealing with, I guess, seeing somebody who doesn't seem happy or who seems in pain and they're just not, they just don't believe you, right? Because that's I think the hard part. I think a lot of people want to convince their relatives that they're doing the right thing and that they should join them over on the therapy side and on the meditation side. What do you say? Like, do you just tell people don't do that, accept it? Or
It depends. It depends on where the client is and what the relationship is with the family. Again, always have to look at the family dynamic. Sometimes, there's, like cases of there was child abuse, and so maybe, a narcissistic parent, like it just depends on what the dynamics are. So in some cases, I know that family therapy is not going to be an option. And I know that sometimes, especially like in certain cultures, where it's just become such a toxic relationship, sometimes it is better to cut ties, because this person has been just so drained emotionally by all of this abuse, whether physical or emotional,
mm,
by the parents, that it's healthier just to cut ties and to work on accepting that family member is never going to go to therapy, never going to be able to have a healthy relationship with that person. And it's sad and it's horrible, but yeah, unfortunately sometimes we have to talk about the reality of cutting ties, because yeah, sometimes the religion or whatever it is, like it's just so ingrained in that person that they're just not going to be able to change. And it is always sad to have those conversations, but yeah, sometimes it is possible. Sometimes it is that you have a family member who's more open-minded, and yeah, they've done some things that maybe have caused some trauma for you, or you're starting to realize like, hey, what they're doing or what they're saying is wrong, and it's caused me to have these insecurities or this anxiety disorder or whatever it is. And so now I'm trying to, unlearn that behavior. And so that's kind of what therapy is as well, in a way. Like we
yeah,
sometimes like reparenting, because our parents, of course, they did the best that they could. And especially like when you have immigrant parents, you have to kind of like juggle both things. You have to, of course, like understand and appreciate their sacrifice and that kind of thing. But you also have to understand, like, yeah, they did their best, and I appreciate that. But also, like these things that they did were problematic, and now I'm dealing with the repercussions of what they said or what they did, and going my whole life hearing these kinds of things, and now it's caused this. And so now I have to go to therapy and be essentially reparented, which sounds maybe a little bit creepy if you don't know what it is, but yeah, essentially like what we do as therapists is we teach you to set those boundaries, right? And we teach you like what it is to be like in a healthy relationship, even with the family member. What does that look like? Is your parent like causing you this anxiety, and is it better to cut ties? Has it gotten to that extreme kind of thing?
yeah. And I mean, you're talking about some of the harmful impacts. What are some of the things that you've seen just culturally that seem to be really harmful for people who are trying to connect with their family members and can't?
Yeah, so some of the things that I've seen, like I've seen a lot of this in like the Indian community, where religion just plays such a big role, and there's just all of these expectations, and there's a lot of manipulation. I've heard horrible stories about, a young woman gets pregnant out of marriage, and a mother threatens to kill herself, and is standing there with a box of rat poison and saying, either you terminate this pregnancy or I will terminate myself right here.
Wow.
And Yeah, so these are, yeah, and so whether it's religion or whether it's cultural, but yeah, so this is very problematic, and I see this a lot, that the parents will try to manipulate their kids, and yeah, and especially when
Right,
the
use
kids
that
start fighting back
extreme.
as adults, yeah, that's when it gets even more problematic. The more that the kids start to question these kinds of attitudes and beliefs, the more that the parents, they become more aggressive in their approaches, and the
Yeah.
manipulation just starts ramping up, and yeah, it becomes really a really terrible situation, and yeah, it leads to trauma.
I mean, it's so interesting. I've seen, and actually, in some Indian folks that I hold space for too, I've seen people's parents really hurt themselves or like sort of show out in signs of physical distress because they feel that somebody's not going to do something or they're overstepping or they're going to leave the family. And there's these
Mhm,
real violent shows of reactions, and I don't
mhm,
know, you know, I don't really know if I fully understand where that comes from because I know, honestly, in my culture, people be dramatic, but the level to which that it's kind of normal to start threatening suicide or things like that around issues related to marriage or gender or things like I don't know that I fully get. Is
mhm.
that something that you sort of understand? Do you have any context for? Is that just something? Because I don't know if that's something that I should be taking lightly or not. I'm genuinely curious, like what you think about like how intense it can get.
I think that it can get really intense, and I have a little bit of lived experience with this because my mom
Mm,
is very religious, and so I have a little bit of I can relate. But at the same time, I know that I will like never understand what it's like to be part of the Indian community and to have those values kind of instilled in you since you're a young girl, and that you need to do this and do that, and if you don't, then we will disown you, and so
mm,
I have clients who have been disowned by their families just because they were divorced. I have a client who actually her husband walked out on her while she was at work. So
wow,
this was nothing that she had done, but the family disowned her because they didn't want a daughter who was divorced.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this is something that I will never understand. I know that the Lebanese community, like they are very, they have these beliefs, and they will disown you if you do if you do things like that. And this is a generalization, of course. I just
But
because
I
I've
think
had one experience,
you're
this was her
you're
experience. I don't
pointing,
know exactly.
yeah, but
Yeah.
you're pointing to something that I think is really real, which is culturally, I think it's more normal than a lot of people realize for people, especially daughters, to feel kind of under the control of their family, like they're sort of property, that there's still an element of that in a lot of cultures where it's like you're going to be transferred from us to your husband, and like there's a
Mhm,
right way to do that and there's a wrong way to do that, and sort of that
mhm,
traditional stuff can leak in, especially when it's survival, because I've worked with people where it's not about I'm getting a husband because that's so romantic. I'm getting a husband
mhm.
because like if I don't, I will not be able to survive or get out of here or.
Mhm. Right. I've talked to women who want to start their own businesses, and they say, well, I have to get married because that's the only way that I'll be able to start a business, or to,
Mhm.
to have more freedom, you need to be married. Sometimes when you travel to certain countries, it's you can't get into a taxi because people say, well, where's your husband?
Mhm.
Like, and so that's the kind of thing that we have to be mindful of when working with people from different cultures, talking to people from different cultures, is that we don't really know what they've been through. And so, yeah, we just have to be mindful that everyone is a little bit different. And yeah, so it has been really interesting to see that. And I love what you said about, yeah, it is important to start seeing yourself, even if your culture says, maybe you are property of the family and then will be transferred over to the husband. It's important to start realizing, like, actually I am my own person, and it's
Mhm.
okay if my values start to kind of deviate from what my family's values are, and that's okay, and I might still be able to have a relationship with them if I'm able to have that conversation with them,
Yeah.
because yeah, luckily some people are becoming more open-minded, not always, not in all cultures. Some people are very stuck in their ways, but yeah, sometimes it is possible to have that conversation, even about, like, like I want to live on my own, like, that's
Yeah.
something that was important to
Yeah.
me. And I always had like the clash of both cultures, like in the Mexican culture, it is very much you live at home until you get married. But I like, in the American culture, you move out when you're 18 and you feel that kind of thing. And I knew that I wanted my own space and I wanted to have that experience of living on my own and doing my own thing before I got married and that kind of thing. So that's why I always encourage clients, like, if that's what you think is important to you, then you should do that and just have that conversation if you can with your family members and just say, like, I think that this is good for this and this reason, and this will allow me to learn this and this, and not have to rely on a man, that kind of thing. And some families are becoming more open to it. Like my parents are happy that I am independent now and that I
Mhm.
don't have to rely on a man.
I was
So
just
they're,
curious
yeah,
how the
they
reaction was.
struggle with it a little
Yeah.
bit, worry, but at the same time they're like, well, no, it's good that you can be all the way in Australia and not have to depend on anyone, kind of thing. And so that's why I really think that it's important to have that time for yourself, and especially, if you go to college, to have your own friends and to have that separate life away from your family. That
Yeah.
way you can, yeah, you can start to develop and grow as a person, and you go on your own journey that's not necessarily tied to that family, because it is hard when you live with your parents, to kind of
Yeah.
be your own person. And so that's why, yeah, I'm hoping that the program that I'm launching, will help first generation college students with that, because
Yeah.
that is something that I'm super passionate about. When your parents don't go to college, and you have immigrant parents who maybe don't know how to help you with that process, don't know how to support you when you're in college, whether
Yeah.
they want you to go to college or they don't. I've seen both sides of the coin, but either way, it's hard, and it's hard to have that separation. And so, yeah, the program that I'm launching is meant to just empower first generation students and to help
Yeah.
them through the college process. Because, at least in my experience, like, I was struggling with all kinds of stuff. And then I turned 18. I was luckily in a college readiness program when I was in high school that actually helped me with applying for FAFSA, applying for scholarships, all that kind of thing. But then when I got to college, I felt like I was just thrown into the deep end of the pool and didn't know how to swim, because I was like, okay, cool, I'm the only brown person in the class. I just
Um,
have nobody that I can relate to, and nobody really knows what I'm dealing with, like back home, with like the pressures from my parents and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, and being the oldest makes it even harder.
yeah.
And so,
Yeah. I
yeah,
mean, we have a
so
question. One of the things that someone's asking is, do you find people just essentially emancipate themselves from their parents or family to live their authentic life? Like that essentially most people that you're working with are really living separate from their families in some regard in order to be more themselves.
sometimes in extreme cases, I do find that people have just cut ties, and sometimes clients come to me when they've already done that and they've decided, like, this is what's best for me, and yeah, pretty much they need to live their authentic lives, and so they've decided, okay, yeah, I'm gonna block them from everything and not gonna have any contact with them, because everything that they're saying to me is just causing more and more harm, and
Yeah.
they just don't know how to have that loving relationship with me as much as I want that. And so, yeah, so sometimes they come to me and they've done that already, and they just need help processing and help dealing with the pain that comes with cutting family ties. Sometimes they come to me and they haven't done that yet, and they're considering it. But yeah, it just depends. Of course, it's not something that I take lightly and that I would recommend to a client, or
Right.
anything like
Just
that.
cut them off. Cancel them
Yeah,
forever.
no. I mean, it is important to have that family. So that's why I always say, like, if you can still keep that relationship, even if you see that your values are very different from your parents. Yeah, maybe you just have to have different, like, safe topics that you talk about. And that's kind of what I've had to do with my parents as well. Like, there's some things that maybe we can't talk about, but that's okay. Like, we can have great conversations about this and about
Mm,
that, and I can still have that relationship with them. But yeah, sometimes you do have to cut ties in that way. And so, and I feel like, one thing that really helps with that, is going to college and is learning about all of these things, because that's actually when I first started, like, learning,
mm,
like, oh, okay, it is normal to do this, and it's not okay that they say that or that they did this, and that's where you kind of start to step into your own. But of
Yeah.
course, it is super helpful if you have like a community of people who are also struggling with that, and they have the clash of both cultures. They have the immigrant parents, and then they're going to college and they're surrounded maybe by a
Yeah.
class of white students who don't really get that. So that's why I'm hoping to start this program so that people can have that sense of community, especially if they have cut ties and they're independent from a young age, then that support is more important, like
And
for another.
I think the coaching program, it really makes me kind of think because a lot of folks that I work with, there is an impact to people not really acknowledging your feelings, like the validity of your feelings. It's always, I've got a bigger story, I've got a harder story, I'm gonna give you something to cry about back in my that sort of stuff, right? I mean,
Mhm.
when you think about emotionally what that actually does to a kid, when you're growing up and that's sort of the frame of reference for your emotions, what do you see kind of happening in terms of what people talk to themselves like or how they are? Like, what's the impact?
Oh yeah, there's a huge impact, and it presents in different ways with everyone, right? And so
Mhm.
someone, yeah, might develop anxiety disorder because of the high pressure. Someone, and sometimes it presents as high functioning anxiety, right? So someone might have great grades and be doing great in their job, and you just can't tell what's really going on in their head, and they're just really
Mm,
struggling. And sometimes it does show up as depression, and sometimes, yeah, a lot of the times it just becomes like these negative core beliefs that you have about yourself, that you're not good enough, or that you're stupid, or things like that. And so yeah, it can become like really problematic, and that's why I love when people come to therapy to unlearn those behaviors, and to see like, okay, why is it that I am this way? Like where did it start? And usually there is a little voice like in the back of our mind telling us this, like you're not good enough. And I always try to tell clients, like, try to think about, can you hear who is saying that? Is it a parent? Is it a
interesting.
partner? Is it an ex-partner? Like who is it that started telling you that now you believe it, and it's an ingrained belief? And so yeah, it is troubling, I think, what you learn as a kid, because it sticks with you.
And I think what a lot of studies kind of back up is that there's a responsibility kind of sense there too around doing the high performance anxiety that you're talking about, right? Where it's like on the outside, I look okay, even if I feel horrible, even if I don't feel good enough, even if I'm thinking everything's my fault, I'm going to mess everything up, that it looks good, that there's kind of a distance between a lot of what people see, which is different than some of the entitlement that a lot of Americans feel when they have emotions, honestly, to just kind of be like, well, I'm having a bad day, I don't really care. Like, and it's, and I think as people try to get more productive, you can see it happening even in Americans, right? Like people get really, they don't function well when they care too much about what people think, right? Like the ideal thing is definitely not putting a bunch of weight on what everybody else wants from you and then cutting off your sort of authentic self from the picture of what happens. What I found really interesting, there's a question here that I'm going to put up, which is just how can you help your parents add to their toolbox without overstepping? Any suggestions? One of the things that I find really interesting is that most women who are coming from cultures where they don't have as much freedom sort of to do what they want as this generation does, they actually kind of have like a weird relationship watching their kids do stuff. It's like on the one hand, I don't want you to not be safe. I don't want you to make stupid choices, things like that. I want you to make sure everything's good. But on the other hand, if this works out for you, I'm a little jealous that you got to do it that way and I had to do all of this stuff to make myself feel safe and good and okay in the world because I would like to travel all over the world and like do whatever I want and not get married when I'm 19 and things like that. And so it's interesting because I think in mother-daughter dynamics there's potential there to have conversations just through your own stuff that's
Yeah.
really nice. But in
Mhm.
terms of skill building, you and I know what the skills look like for people who need some of them. Do you think if your parents won't go to family therapy with you and they won't go to therapy themselves, that there's a way to still support them and give them some of what they need in that area.
Yeah, I think with some parents who are a bit more open-minded, there is like ways that you can add to their toolbox, right? And if you are trying to have these conversations with them, especially like if you have a parent who's more avoidant, then maybe you tell them like, hey, like like I really want to have this conversation with you, and maybe you just keep bringing it up until they actually like sit down with you and talk
Mm,
about it until they realize like, okay, she's not going to go away and we need to talk about this.
and
And so
force
yeah,
them into the
sometimes like
skills.
you are an annoying person because yeah, especially dealing with the parent who is avoidant, you have to say like it's time for us to sit down and have this conversation. And I know that you don't want to talk about this, but it's important for us to do this. And even like maybe suggesting using I statements, and that way it's not that they're putting the blame on you and saying that you did this to me or you caused this or whatever it is, but instead saying like I feel, or I think.
Yeah.
So that could be helpful as well. Just yeah, just off the top of my head, that's what I'm kind of thinking with avoidance
Yeah.
parents. Yeah,
Yeah. And I mean,
actually, yeah,
avoidance
convincing them to sit down.
avoidance is a big one. I mean, parents love a good avoid, but then there's obviously confrontational parents from all sorts of other cultures. It really depends. What I
Yeah,
think is
it's
interesting
so
is
hard to say.
even the clients that I've worked with, even the people I've worked with where their families have abuse in them, where there's a lot of discord, where there's a lot of things going on, there are open-minded people in the house who are really willing to sort of move towards something better. Because for most of the people, if it doesn't feel good to be in the house, you're not the only one. Like it wasn't just unpleasant for you growing up. It's like, oh no, they weren't happy, you weren't happy. Everybody was kind of stressed out and traumatized and upset. And so it is really interesting because just in doing what you're talking about, which is like breaking cycles, like don't let your parent just avoid talking to you about something that really matters to you. That's just a simple cycle to break.
Yeah, and it's easier said than done because I think nobody really wants to have that conversation, right? But
We all know what it's going
sometimes,
to look like if you bring it up and
mhm.
talk about it.
Yeah, and sometimes they're avoidant for so long that you don't know what it's actually going to look like. Like, how's it going to come out when someone actually like is forced to yeah, sit with their emotions and talk about like whatever it is that happened. Will they explode on you? Will they blame you? Will it become even more problematic? So yeah, that's what's helpful about being in therapy. I think is that you have someone. If the conversation doesn't go so well, then you have someone to talk to about it and to process with and
Yeah.
yeah, who can give you advice on okay, maybe try this next time or like okay, now we know that this parent has this style, so yeah, it is kind of all a learning experience and we're all just doing our best, aren't we?
Yeah. And I mean, I think what's nice about this generation is I think a lot of people are owning that something feels off or something feels wrong and they want to do something about it, right? Like in sort of a more personalized way than just safety and survival, which is fine that before this, everybody was sort of focused on that. But it definitely feels like something where we have to get beyond survival. And I know there's like talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome and all these sort of words that are coming up around generational trauma for Black folks. But I'm curious, when you think about Mexican American generational trauma, like that just sort of how it's getting passed down and how it shows up, what do you think of?
Yeah, it shows up in a lot of different ways. Like there's so many things that we can get into, but yeah, essentially it is yeah, it is that when you have immigrant parents, whether they're Mexican or they're from somewhere else,
Mhm.
it is just the whole thing of, like I sacrificed this for you, so you
Mhm.
need to give me this in return, and you need to do this and be this, and you feel guilty saying no, and so that's the problem that I see,
Mm.
and so whenever your values just start to look a little bit different from your parents, or you start to go against their wishes, then there's always that guilt. And some parents are going to guilt trip you more than others. And that's when it becomes even more problematic. And that can stay with you for a long time. And then you'll have regrets for doing, maybe the thing that you really wanted to do to pursue your passion or that kind of thing, because there's always going to be that guilt of, well, they wanted me to do this, and maybe I should have stayed home and helped the family instead of going to
Right.
college, or maybe I should have gone to college instead of quitting and getting a job like they wanted me to. It could go both ways. So yeah,
Yeah,
there are a lot of differences even between like Mexican Americans. But yeah, that is
yeah,
one thing
yeah.
I all the time, like the
And
guilt.
there's a lot of
We
reasons
want
to,
to,
yeah,
we
there's a
want
lot
to
of reasons to
sacrifice.
immigrate. I wonder
Yeah.
if you could say something to parents who are immigrating, who are raising children. Like, what's something that you would really want to get across in terms of now that you see all these grown folks, this is just the results of need to reparent. What would
The result.
you, right? What would you say to the parents?
I would just say and I've met actually a lot of parents, immigrant parents who are just starting to learn even about like, this is what it means to raise a third culture kid essentially, right? Like they're gonna grow up in a culture that's outside of mine. And I would just say like, yeah, just try to acknowledge that they're growing up in a totally different culture from the one that you grew up in. And so the norms are gonna be totally different. And so you have to really limit your expectations and just let your kid be whoever they want to be and follow their passions and just understand that maybe they're not going to be exactly the way that you want them to be, but just let them be their own person and just support them in their choices. And yeah, I think that's super important. And just I think that it's super cool when parents they let their kids choose, their religion, or they let them, choose how much they want to be a part of, of their culture, when
Yeah.
maybe they've grown up in a different culture and maybe they just want to become like Americanized or whatever,
Mm,
and they really don't want anything to do with that. And that might hurt a little bit, but you have to let
yeah,
them make their own choice. And it could be that later on in life, they really want to
exactly.
get involved and learn about their heritage and that kind of thing. So you have to let them go through their own journey, because it is hard to balance both cultures when you're growing up. And there's always like that
Yeah.
shame, and I've talked about this with friends who are third culture kids, right? And we always say like, the shame of even like a name, or the shame of like opening your lunchbox and it having like very different food to your American peers and that kind of thing.
Just being
And
different.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so it is to balance both cultures. And so for parents, I would just say try to be as understanding, try not to take it personally, like they're
Mm,
just learning how to navigate both. And so if they ask you, can you call me this by this name, even if it's not the name that you gave them, then maybe just accept that. Maybe later on in life they'll
mm.
appreciate, like, this name was given to me because it's part of my culture, and they'll start to embrace it. But it's a journey, it's a process, so
I could
yeah, you just
definitely
have
see if I named my kids something and they started saying, "No, mom, call me John." I would be a little like, "All right,
yeah,
all right,
yeah.
John. Like I don't want to. I don't care. Like I'm calling you your government." But in any case, we're gonna take a little break because we actually are getting past our 30 minutes, and so I want to make sure that everybody can get to their primetime TV over here because it's important. We got DVRs and stuff, but it's important. So
Mhm.
when we come back, I'm going to do my tarot card pull of the day. And we're just going to take a little break to get a message from our sponsors. Welcome back. And I've got my good old trusty Afro Goddess tarot deck out so that I can make my pull for the day. I mean, I'm interested in what really to take away from this because the hard part, I think, for me is working with families. I guess maybe the most important thing in what I just heard you say is kind of that the kids are tasked to doing the same thing the parents are, which is like try to trust that they're doing the best they can with what they've got because
That's
that's half the journey, right? Like, can you actually believe that your parents did do their best? They're not just, you know, idiots or that they didn't really just do that because they're assholes, that there actually is a deeper feeling and a deeper meaning to the way that your parents care for you, which is a really hard thing to understand. But I think it's every parent's worst fear is that their kid is going to totally misinterpret why they raised them the way that they did and just be like, just like cancel that lady. She did the worst job ever. Like if they
Yep.
really were intentional. And some parents make missteps and truly make moral blunders and have to really deal with that. But for the most part, we trying to communicate like, Mom, I care about you. And our moms are kind of like, okay, I care about you too. But life is scary. I don't think people can really sort of fully understand how scary an immigration experience is for a person who doesn't know a language and doesn't know a culture and really has to figure things out and raise kids. So, two-way streets. And I'm always telling people, I'm like, oh, well, from a person who's seen a lot of kids that have done a lot of things, like, let me tell you, being a parent is a very mortifying experience. Even if you just see the kids next door get arrested, you're like, like what's going on over here? Yeah. So let's get our tarot pull and see what it is that the ancestors want us to take away today about this conversation. What if your family doesn't believe in mental health? What should our takeaway be? So this is the Magician card. She's the first card in the deck.
Magician.
Yeah. So the Magician card, right side up, which is important because if she was upside down, we'd have some trouble. But right side up, all that she means is that she's focused and that she's seeing through her third eye. And so that becomes kind of the bridge between, like her intuition becomes the bridge between. So it's the bridge between thought and action, just as the bridge between the spirit world and the physical plane. It's up to her to use her unique skills, logic, and intellect to manifest and bring forth something new. So the number 1 is a sign of new beginnings. And in the beginning, you will often have to use what you have and be the magician, right? And so when we're talking about third culture kids, we're talking about first go rounds. You're going to just have to use whatever you think you've got and create whatever you think you can create, right? Like you don't have a template. This is not where your parents are from. And so this is kind of what you were talking about when we were starting, right? This is just figuring out a whole third space to occupy. Is a very powerful card, and it represents the notion that all you need to be great is what you already have right before you. Often we doubt ourselves, but why? We're great and can do great things. And the chances are with some effort that the very greatness is only just around the corner. So allow this card to spark your willpower and urge you to manifest your deepest desires. At this moment, the magician acts with great awareness and concentration. So that means if you want to travel around the world, manifest it. Do what you want to do. Talk to your parents. Don't let them avoid you. Try to have the conversation. If you want things to change, you can change.
That can be the change.
That can be the place they start. And families, this is well studied, folks. If anybody changes, they all change. So luckily, there's no way that you can change yourself without people doing something. I don't know if it's always the best adjustment, but they must do that.
Yep. The first step is getting yourself the help that you need. And don't worry about if they don't want to come to therapy at first with you. Don't worry if they never want to come to therapy. You're still going to be the change, even if you start working on yourself and you start unlearning those behaviors that are so ingrained in you, that came from your parents, that just came from your culture and everyone that you're surrounded by. It all starts with you, and it does make a difference. You might not see it right away. You may never see it, but it's there. It's happening.
And you might want to ask yourself if your culture has tried to teach you that you can't manifest what you want using what you have, right? That you have to be whiter, that you have to be more religious, that you have to be better, more good, a better student, a higher achiever. That is it not enough just for your authentic self to be able to do what you need to do, because there's a lot of messages that kind of support the idea that that's not true. But when I tell you guys, it's mostly just messages. This is why you come into the therapy room. This is why you go see Nancy. This is why you come to the college, to the first generation college student support group, so y'all can talk to each other and go, wait a minute, you too, and realize nothing's wrong with you.
Yeah, that's real. Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy. Can you let folks know where to find you if they want to find you after the episode?
Yeah, sure. So my therapy is just called Global Citizen Therapy, and So you can find me on social media under that handle, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube channel, and my website is just www.globalcitizentherapy.com. And yeah, once you follow me, you can DM me if you have any questions, you want to continue the conversation. I told Chantal I love having conversations like this, so always looking for the opportunity. So if you want me to go live with you or join a podcast and talk about these things, it's so important to get the message out. And I think not enough people are talking about this.
Yeah.
And, the number of immigrants in the US and everywhere is growing. And so that means that there's going to be more immigrant children, and more third culture kids. So yeah, it's important to have these conversations and to talk about unlearning these behaviors and what that looks like and how can we fill our toolboxes. And feel free to message me, get in touch with me. My email is also the same, info@globalcitizentherapy.com. So yeah, get in touch with me. There's a million ways. So yeah, let's keep the conversation going.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. I feel like the thing that's missing right now is community. So I'm glad that there's going to be a support group for first generation college students so they are not stuck in their heads. So go sign up. If you're coming into that situation, do not cope alone. Break the cycle. And I'll see you here next week. We are going to have a guest on talking about how to embrace your sexuality just a little bit more. So please tune into that. And we will see you here next week on People Always Ask. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
We're signing off. See you next week.
Just call me when you get up or get out or get off. And I'll hit you when I get down and get in and get on. Just call me when you get up or get out or get off. And I'll hit you when I get down and get in and get on. Baby, you could just call me when you get up or get out or get off. And I'll hit you when I get down and get in and get on.